So tonight we have with us Sara. I was going to say to Katz Presley. I don't know why. Sorry about that, Sara. And we have Geoff and Myrthe, and all three will be speaking tonight on the topic of owls. So I had to put this slide in that Gerald has, this photo, because we have three speakers and it just looked too darn cute to pass up the opportunity. So I hope you guys don't mind. But anyways, I'm going to turn it over to the three. I'm not sure who's speaking first, are going to command the post here. If you'd like to start your presentation and introduce yourself, that would be awesome. So we've got Saw-whet Owls tonight. So take it away.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And Geoff here. And thanks for fitting us into the schedule. One of the reasons for giving this talk now is, Myrthe has got to start at the start, is that we have a special intern with us from Europe, from Belgium, Myrthe, and she's going to give part of the presentation, and you'll understand why as we proceed. So Myrthe, the other thing I should note as we start is Myrthe is controlling the slides from the Bird Observatory field station out at Beaverhill Lake. The talk is solar powered and transmitted to you via our 80-foot communications tower.
Geoff, if you just can crank up your volume a little bit, we're having difficulties hearing you.
Oh yeah, I see that my dog. Sorry. Is that better? Is that better?
Yes. Yes, definitely better. Yes.
Sorry about that. Hopefully it stays fine. Please tell me, otherwise I can switch to my smartphone, which has got good volume too. So yeah, as I was saying, this is coming to you, the slides are coming to you from the Bird Observatory field station with solar power. So it's pretty cool that we're able to transmit to the world. And while this is happening, some of the BBO staff are just setting up the mist nets and actually trapping saw-whets as we speak. So next slide, please. Myrthe, thanks. So you've already read the title. I won't repeat it. Next slide. So this story is somewhat personal in that I first published an article about the migration of saw-whet owls in 1975. So, yep, pushing almost 50 years ago, which obviously makes me old. I banded my first owls at Long Point, and more excitingly, we actually as a teenager, used to roam Center Island in Toronto with nooses, and we could actually find saw-whets roosting in the willows and on Center Island, gently noose them, take them out of the noose, band them, and let them go. So we knew there was a migration underway well before John Woods and I published this article, but there was some doubt since saw-whet owls overwinter in southern Ontario. They breed in southern Ontario, so there was a question for many years as to whether they actually migrated. So in 1975, John and I teamed up, published this article showing not only the migration, the slides on the picture on the right, we actually speculated that the owls were not able to cross the Appalachian Mountains, which we now know is not true, but that's all the data we had at the time. And also the center slide showing that the migration was earlier, the further north a state or province occurred. Next slide. My next major involvement with saw-whet owls came with the Christmas bird count. So I think you're all familiar with the Christmas bird count centered in Edmonton. Go ahead, next slide. And this shows the number of saw-whets recorded on the Edmonton Christmas bird count starting in 1906 when Sidney Stansel did our first count in Edmonton. The first saw-whets weren't recorded until 76, 77. And then I moved to Edmonton in 84 and got involved with Cam Finley and Jim Butler, and we started a major initiative to expand the Christmas bird count. I had a student, Andrea Sissons, who experimented with playback. experimented with playback in South Edmonton and showed that if we played the saw-whet owl call first, then the saw-whets would reply, and then we could do a great horned owl afterwards. If we did the reverse and played the great horn first, then the saw-whets wouldn't call. So using that as a model, we experimented. Jim Beck and Barb Beck took the program in hand and created the owl prowl for the Christmas bird count. And I saw that Chuck and Lisa are on this call, Priestley's, they were heavily involved too, especially in zone 1. And you can see the result. We had, in some of these years, we had more saw-whets reported in Edmonton than anywhere else in North America. So here we thought we had a rare species. It turns out in the winter, if you go looking for them, they're actually way more common than we thought. And you can see it peaked at 26 owls in, what, about 1993. There was a good run of owling in the early 2000s, and then part of the purpose of this slide is to point out in recent years the number of saw-whets has petered off, and I would suggest that's not because there aren't saw-whets here, it's actually because we're not looking for them. So maybe some of the listeners can, younger than me, can get out at midnight on count day, stay up till midnight on count day, and see what in fact owls are still in the Edmonton area and the river valleys and woodlots. That would be great to see. But the bottom line of this slide was that we discovered that in fact saw-whets do overwinter in the Edmonton area. Next slide. So then Sarah's taking over.
Thanks, Geoff. So for those of you who don't know, the Beaverhill Bird Observatory, where we're going to be sharing our data from, is located about 80 kilometers east of Edmonton on the historical shorelines of Beaverhill Lake. Next. Next. There it is. Our owl monitoring program usually operates from early September, from 1st of September until early November, depending on snowfall. We've been monitoring our saw-whet owls at the Beaverhill Bird Observatory since '97, but we didn't begin a standardized monitoring program with consistent protocols until 2002. And so this standardized protocol involves us setting up 4 mist nets in the same location every fall and broadcasting the vocalization of a male saw-whet owl by those nets, so that as our owls are flying through on migration, they hear a vocalization, they're interested, detour, and then hit the net. And we'll check them every half hour, so there's never an owl in there longer than that. Bring them back to the lab, and then ban them, process them, and release them to continue their migration. And on a range from year to year, we usually catch anywhere from 300 to 500 owls in one season. Next. And over the 20 years that we've been monitoring our owls, our programs have grown and expanded to include other species. We started targeting our boreal owls about a decade ago after we were continuously catching them as bycatch in our saw-whet nets. And as of 5 years ago, we started targeting our long-eared owls. And even in the last 4 years, we've been running a pilot project looking at broadcasting a female saw-whet owl audio call to try and increase our male capture rate during fall migration, see if that has an impact. But for the purposes of today's talk, we're just going to focus on our male audio call and the 20 years of data that we've been able to collect using that vocalization in those 4 nets. Next. And so here is a beautiful graph showing the total number of captures of saw-whet owls over the 20-year period of monitoring. As you can see, their population is cyclical. They have high years and low years in accordance to rodent abundance and food availability. And what's really interesting is in 2015 and 16, we had a really good couple years of breeding, and their population or capture numbers increased substantially. And then we go back into our cycle. And as fun as this graph is, and interesting, it's not as effective as it is to look at the total number of owls captured, but more so what's more valuable is to look at the capture rate, so the effort of owls, or the amount of effort we put in to try and capture our owls, because that gives you a more standardized view and understanding of our captures overall of the owl population. So next. So here is a beautiful graph of our capture rate per 100 playback hours. So how many owls are we catching in a 100 playback hour period? over the years. Our red line is the total, which is what we saw beforehand, but now in capture rate. And it's very similar to the previous graph. And we've also broken it down into hatch year and after hatch year. And you can see that our hatch year birds, our birds that hatched this spring, really drive the overall capture rate across the season because we are netting in the fall. And so we're catching all of the young in the year. And as well as Geoff briefly mentioned, is that in fall migration, the average number of owls that we're catching, about 70% of them tend to be hatch year birds. And then we also catch a substantial amount of female after hatch year birds. So it's our females and hatchers that are migrating in the fall, where our males on average stick around all year to defend their breeding territory. Next. And so when looking at all this data, we have to do some filtering before we can do some more analysis in it, because over the time period, our protocols for running the duration of the nets has changed, as has our start and end time of the season. And so we took our 20 years of data, filtered it to look at a 4-hour time window to be consistent from year to year. And then we also filtered our timeline across the season by 98% of our overall captures, which is what this graph is showing. It's showing our capture rates across the years by date. And by filtering it by 98% of total captures, that gives us a cutoff date of starting September 12th and ending November 8th. And so this helps to clean up our data when we didn't start on September 1st or when we didn't run our nets into mid-November. So it gives us a much more consistent data to look at. So next. And when we look at this data and we look at 5% passage date, so that's where 5% of our owls have just started to migrate to head south for the winter, we see this lovely small little trend line where it looks like over the years, our owls potentially might be starting to migrate about 1 day earlier than historically. It's not a huge trend line, but it is there. And potentially with time, we might see this trend line becoming more and more prominent. So that's kind of interesting to see. But what's really interesting is next. Looking at the 50% passage date, or the median in migration, your peak in migration, where half of the owls have now passed through the area. And in the last 20 years, we have seen that number actually advance. So migration seems to be getting a little bit later by about 4 days when you're looking at the trend line. Now, this trend line is not statistically significant, but it could be biologically significant. And with more data and more years of analysis, I would expect potentially to see this line continue to grow. And this line, this 4% 4-day advancing is actually still present even when you take out the outlier year of 2013. So it's really interesting to see. Next. And then for the end of migration, when 95% of our owls have passed through the area, we're not seeing much of a trend line at all. It's pretty flat, so it seems like our owls might be starting to migrate, we said 1 day earlier, but they're leaving en masse, the 50%, about 4 days later. And then the end of migration, it's kind of nothing really happening there. And that could be potentially because of our end dates. Not every year are we able to get past November 8th, and due to snowfall and weather conditions for accessing the site. So that could be definitely influencing our end of season graphs. But just kind of interesting to see how our owls are passing through over the years. Next. And so next, we have Myrthe, who is a volunteer from Belgium. She's actually been doing her master's at a university over there, and she's going to share with us some of her analysis looking at saw-whet owl migration out east in North America. So Myrthe, take it away.
Okay. So yeah, I did my master's thesis on saw-whet owl migration phenology in Eastern North America, and this was at Ghent University in Belgium. And it was in collaboration with the Hauck Mountain Sanctuary in United States. And so what I did is I analyzed 30 years of data from 7 banding stations across Eastern North America, of which 2 stations were located in Canada and 5 were located in the United States. And the aim of the study was to assess if the saw-whet owl migration phenology is changing over time. Yeah, and I'm going to share with you some of my findings and then compare them to what we've learned from the data at the Beaverhill Bird Observatory. Yes. So when I did a similar analysis as what Sara just has explained to you. And so when I looked at the 5% and the 95% passage dates, I did not find any significant change of the migration timing over the years. But when I looked at the 50% passage dates, I found a significant delay of passage timing over the years. And this was around 1 day per decade. And this is similar to what has been found for the diurnal raptors. So compared to BPO, this is the graph you saw earlier from Sara's. At Beaverhill Bird Observatory, we found around 4 days of a delay. So it's very similar, a similar trend, but different data sets. So then another thing I did was I did a time to event analysis, which is a little bit more complex method of looking at the timing until an event of interest occurs, which is for us the timing of saw-whet owl migration. And I was able to visualize the data and get graphs like this, in this graph you can see my 7 sites. So every curve is a different site in a different color. And this graph shows the cumulative migration, the cumulative passage of saw-whet owls over the years, over the season. And so what you can see from this graph is that the most northern site, which is in this case the purple graph, which is in Quebec, witnesses migration of saw-whet owls earlier in the fall season than sites more south, which is the red graph. And this makes sense since the saw-whet owls are migrating south. It makes sense that banding stations more north see migration earlier than banding stations in the south. And then I made these graphs for all my sites separately to look at the cumulative passage of saw-whet owls over the years. And then I get graphs like this, in which you can see the cumulative passage and the differences over the years. And interesting from this graph is that you can look at the whole event distribution. So you don't only look at the 5%, 50%, or 95% passage dates, like the analysis we've done before. But you can look at the whole fall season and what's happening there. And interesting here is you can see that there is a lot of variation between the years. And you can see that this graph gives us way more information than looking at just one single point in the distribution. So, for example, if you look at the 5% passage date, you would say that there is an advance over time. So the more recent years are darker, you would see that migration is occurring earlier in the fall. But when you look at the 95% passage dates, it looks like the migration is getting delayed in the end of the fall season. And so what you can see from this graph is when this is happening, it looks like the migration season is getting longer over time. So this kind of graphs gives us more information of what's happening with the saw-whet owls and their movements. And so I made a similar graph for the data of the Beaverhill Bird Observatory and got this graph in which we basically see the same thing. There's a lot of variation between the years, and there seems to be differences between the phases of migration. So differences between where you're looking at, which point you're looking at in the plots. So a little summary for this is that we found that the 50% passage dates of the saw-whet owl migration is getting delayed over time. And this was not significant for the Beaverhill Bird Observatory, but it was in Eastern North America. And even though it was not statistically significant, it's very possible that it's biologically significant since it was already a delay of 4 days. And over time, this delay might getting even more prominent. And this shows the importance of long-term monitoring. And we need more study to understand the saw-whet owl movements. There's still very much we can learn about this species movements, and especially when we want to look at how this species is reacting to climate change, we need more long-term monitoring of its movements. Now Geoff will take over again.
After I unmute. Thank you. Thank you, Myrthe and Sara. So that gives you a good idea of what's happening at Beaverhill Bird Observatory. And they are, in fact, obviously migrating, and the migration time is shifting and getting somewhat earlier and somewhat later, depending upon the time of year. The question then is, where are they going? So these are, next couple of maps are from eBird, so they're not totally representative of the distribution of saw-whet owls because they're limited by the records that are in eBird. And I guess I'll put in a little pitch here that if you're enjoying this talk and learning, please report your bird sightings in eBird so that maps like this can be more complete. But you can see in a major portion of British Columbia and northern Alberta is part of the breeding range of saw-whet owls. Excuse me, and then again in central Manitoba and across northern Ontario and in the Great Lakes. The question then is, where are they migrating to and from? So I also bring your attention to the breeding range further south. So the owls are actually breeding in Washington, Oregon, in western Montana and Idaho, and even down into Colorado. And it doesn't really show any records here, because you'll see we now know they're also breeding in South Dakota. So we can use these maps to try and infer where migration might occur. Next slide. So the second slide is the fall migration according to eBird. Again, not a lot of northern records, but you can see the owls are more widespread now in Saskatchewan and especially down into the Midwestern U.S., northern central U.S., the Dakotas, where they were not common breeders. Next slide. And then winter range. So obviously these birds are, for the most part, not going north-south. They're actually more going east-west. If they're going north-south, we'd expect them to be down in Mexico, like burring owls, but in fact they're not. So there are still owls wintering in southern British Columbia and in the states underneath that, and then more commonly around the Great Lakes and into northeastern United States. So the owls, we can expect the migration is actually more east-west than north-south. Next slide. And then this is in the spring. So again, they're more widespread in the spring, especially through places like central Saskatchewan, although this could well be a function of the fact that they're calling more, and eBird observers are more likely to record them than they are when the owls aren't calling and are relatively hard to detect. But again, they're quite common down through the Rocky Mountain states of the western U.S. Next slide. And this kind of summarizes all that information. These maps are available on eBird. If you want to look at them, eBird is a website of Cornell University. But the breeding season, you can see, is a red band across British Columbia and Alberta, and then southern Manitoba and northern Ontario. The purple band is a year-round range. Next slide. So in 2021, we had some pretty exciting band recoveries that demonstrated quite a bit about the bird migration, which we know from more extensive studies that I'll come to in a minute. The red star is where Beaverhill is. We get quite a few recoveries from Harold Fisher, who's the small arrow. I don't have, my mouse won't show you, but the small arrow headed into Prince Albert. And so a lot of our owls are going east. And curiously, Harold picks up more of our owls a year after we banded them, or 2 years after we banded them, than we pick up of his owls. So I can't explain that. We don't have a good explanation, but we do know, thanks to Harold and others in Saskatchewan who are banding, that the owls head east from here. And then you can see the long green arrow headed to Pennsylvania. So this arrow actually has, at least the version I last saw, this one doesn't, should have two heads on the arrow. So last fall, we were pretty excited to catch a banded owl, and it turns out it was banded in 2020 in Pennsylvania as part of one of the banding stations that Myrthe has just told us about. And we thought that was pretty cool. However, a couple of weeks later, Shane, one of our biologists, banded a saw-whet owl, and it was recovered 17 days later at the same place in Pennsylvania that the other owl we had caught was banded in 2020. So this owl went something in the order of 3,000 kilometers in 17 days or less. And obviously it could have taken a non-direct route and traveled more than 3,000 kilometers. So this is a pretty amazing recovery and an indication of where these owls are moving, and in some cases moving in a hurry. The other arrow there coming from South Dakota is a very curious one. This was an owl that we trapped, banded. It was already banded, and it was actually banded in South Dakota as a nestling. So we caught it in the fall of 2021, and it was actually banded in May of 2020 as a nestling in South Dakota. So the question then is, what's it doing up here? So the next slide. So this is a map that published by Lisa Priestley and Chuck Priestley in 2010, showing band recoveries from banding stations in Alberta and Saskatchewan and where they were going. So you can see the bulk of them were headed southeast, just like our Pennsylvania recovery from last year. There actually is one prairie band recovery all the way across to Maine in the U.S. There's some that are have gone west. There was one on this map shows a band recovery from a Rocky Point Bird Observatory to Saskatchewan, but in fact the Bird Observatory's had two other band recoveries now from Bird Observatory to Vancouver and Victoria. So we know some of these owls are actually going west and crossing the Rocky Mountains. And then you also note there's a band recovery from central Saskatchewan down into Colorado. And the question is then, how consistent are all of these movements? So I don't have a slide to illustrate this, but I'll just talk about Chuck Priestley's thesis, where he studied stable isotopes in saw-whet owls and discovered that a lot of the saw-whet owl feathers, the isotopes in the feathers of the owls that we catch at Beaverhill Bird Observatory in the fall actually come from the south of us. So he hypothesized that half to 3/4 of the owls were actually living in the western U.S., came north into the boreal forest in the late summer, and then streamed east, or maybe in some cases went back south with the onset of winter. So it could be that we've actually got a dispersal from breeding areas to the south to areas in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then back south and or back to eastern North America. Obviously, the recoveries to the west also indicate some of our owls are spending time in BC. And in fact, the stable isotopes analysis that Chuck did is consistent with even some of the owls that we trap at Beaverhill, having spent the summer in some of the valley bottoms in British Columbia as well. So the movements of these owls is still very confusing, and even less is known about their spring return. Next. So I guess I've jumped ahead and told you about the Harold Fisher in Saskatchewan. And the other note is I told you earlier about the Christmas bird count results of overwintering owls. These are particularly males, and I caught an owl banded that I had banded at BBO in October. I caught it at my place in December. So an owl that we thought was migrating in October at BBO, in fact, was still here in the winter. And likewise, another owl that was banded in October at BBO was found dead near Calgary. So another indication that some of these owls that are moving in the fall and getting caught in our banding programs are in fact staying over the winter, and in the last case, paying for that choice with their life. The bird was not in good shape and was found dead. Next. And Sara, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Geoff. So there's still a lot of questions we have with the overall movement of our saw-whet owls. And as Geoff mentioned, Chuck Priestley's master's thesis about our owls potentially coming from the south and heading to the north in the summertime before heading south for the full winter. A lot of these questions can be answered by this new wildlife tracking system called MODIS. And MODIS, instead of us just catching, banding a bird, releasing it, and hoping it gets captured somewhere else, we can now catch a bird, band it, and give them a MODIS nanotag. This little nanotag acts like a backpack on their back, and it's less than 3% of the bird's weight, so it's not going to impact their ability to fly. It's very lightweight. And by releasing this bird, you no longer have to individually catch that bird. It just has to fly within 15 kilometers a tower, a MODIS tower, and it pings. So it's going to greatly increase our data set. It's going to give us very accurate mapping of some of our migratory birds. And these tags are actually so small they can be put onto bats, butterflies, really any mobile wildlife. And so this MODIS wildlife tracking system is really changing our understanding of how wildlife are moving across the landscape, and it's helping us to answer some of these questions we still have about them. So next. So this is the network currently of MODIS towers across North America. As you can see, there's quite a lot of towers out east, because this is where this MODIS technology first started. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of towers found along the East Coast and throughout Eastern North America. And in the last 8 years, we're actually seeing more and more towers coming up. Here in the West, there's been a huge effort to establish more MODIS towers so that we can have this network in place to start tagging some of our animals to learn more about their movements. Next. And so again, here in the West, it's newer technology, and we have a good number of towers happening in BC, and in Alberta, we actually only have 5 MODIS towers in place. And the one with the big yellow arrow on it, that is the Beaverhill Bird Observatory. So next. And so the Beaverhill Bird Observatory established its MODIS tower technically last year, but we had some solar power technical issues. And so it's actually finally went up online as of July this year. And so our tower is active. If we get any bird flying by with a MODIS tag on it, we will get notified. And we are now contributing to this not only North American wide network, but it's actually a global network now. MODIS has gone global. And our MODIS tower is only possible because of the support of donors, including you guys, Edmonton Nature Club. Thank you so much. You helped to fund us purchasing the 80-foot tower that we put our antennae on, as well as the Environment and Climate Change Canada donated the equipment for us so that we can now be part of this wildlife tracking system. Next. And what's really exciting is that out west at Rocky Point Bird Observatory, they have put a huge effort in the last couple of years to collaborate with other organizations to get a huge network of MODIS towers stretched across the Rocky Mountains, as well as along the coastal line of BC. And by making the effort and getting these towers erected in advance, they actually now have it set up so that they are deploying MODIS tags on saw-whet owls. And so as of this year, they deployed 35 nanotags on our little saw-whet owls, and they're able to now start tracking their movements during fall migration, and hopefully in the spring they might get some hits as well. But by having these MODIS towers and this network up, this is actually helping us to fill in the gaps of where we don't have necessarily banding stations. Because there's not a lot of banding stations found out in the coastal line on BC. And honestly, these towers are game-changing and providing us a lot more data. So these towers are filling in our knowledge gaps, or survey gaps, I should say, so that we can get a lot more knowledge and information. So I'm very excited to see Rocky Point Bird Observatory deploying tags on saw-whet owls. We hope to do that here at the Beaverhill Bird Observatory in the next couple of years. We just need to get more towers up in the province to make it worthwhile, but it's very exciting to see. Next. And so if you guys are interested in learning more about owl movement and migration, and if you want to see owls or saw-whet owls up close and personal, feel free to join one of our owl banding events. At the Beaverhill Bird Observatory, we host the public 4 nights a week throughout the owl banding season. We do this through a ticketed event because it is a fundraiser for us because we are a not-for-profit. And we are unfortunately completely sold out this year. But if you guys become lifetime members of the BBO for just $10, you'll get advance access to tickets next year. So our members get a 3-day advance access to our ticketed events, not only owl banding, but songbird banding. And that way you won't miss out for next year. Next. And if you can't wait till next year, what you can do is potentially contact us to have our BirdSmart education program come to you. And so in the winter months, we run this education program called BirdSmart that brings live birds of prey into classrooms to teach students about birds, conservation, and climate change. We also do adult presentations, seniors home presentation, adult birthday parties, all education focused, of course, but that is another way that you can meet a live bird of prey up close and personal. So if you're interested in that, feel free to contact us. All the information is on our website. Next. And so a big thank you to our sponsors. I'm not going to read them all out, but the Beaverhill Bird Observatory would not be possible without the support and help of multiple different organizations, private funders, and donors. We have a huge board of directors and a large, massive number of volunteers to help with all of our research and conservation work that we do. And without them, we would not be able to do the research that we are doing and to learn so much about our saw-whet owls in the last 20 years. So a big thank you to them. Next. And thank you for your time and interest. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and we are happy and eager to answer any questions you might have.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Sara, Myrthe, and Geoff. That was great. Really fascinating to see what's happening with our owls, and good to see that this MODIS information is really taking off and giving us some ideas of what's happening out there. So we've got a few questions and comments in the box. Do you want me to read them, or do you guys want to do that?
You can go ahead and moderate it for us, Karen.
Okay. So I'm just going to the top again. So somebody asked a question for Myrthe if the weather conditions were taken into consideration in her work and mapping.
Yeah, that was originally the plan, but then we didn't get the data in time, so I was not able to include it in the analysis. So future analysis will have to include weather data as well. That would be very interesting.
Then we had a comment about someone made that the owls looked like they were moving away from the boreal forest in winter.
That's probably partly a function of where people are to find the owls. So the band recovery, obviously we band them at Beaverhill and other places. There's several people around Edmonton, the Priestleys do and I do and others, but there's nobody in the boreal forest looking for them. And for as far as eBird's concerned, there's fewer of us going into the boreal forest and even harder to detect the saw-whet owls. So it's partly a problem of where the observers are and what they're observing and what the owls are doing. And that would be one advantage of having a whole system of MODIS towers, is that if they were strategically placed every 30 kilometers across the landscape, then we can track an owl from one station to the next, just like they're able to do in southern Ontario and eastern US.
Okay, then we had another question as to what other locations for these MODIS towers are located in Alberta. Right,
so one is at the Ellis Bird Farm. Myrthe Pierman, who used to head the Ellis Bird Farm, actually installed one at or near her place on Sylvan Lake. There's one in Calgary, And then I'm not quite sure where the fifth one was. I'd have to look at the map again. Environment Canada has plans to install 5 more. I believe they're related to the prairie songbird monitoring program, so they're likely to be in southern Alberta. But that would be good because that would pick up in the context of saw-whet owls. That would be good. Oh, there. So Myrthe, we'll interrupt here. If you can see Myrthe's picture, I texted Jana, our biologist on duty, on the first floor. I should point out Myrthe's on the second floor, and there's a live saw-whet owl just ready to get its band
Just
and
need a
be
screen
sent
share.
on its way.
We get a screen share?
Myrthe, can you do a screen share, please? That would make it bigger. Good idea. Thanks, Karen.
I don't know what you mean, because if I share my screen, I will just see everyone double, right?
There should be a command. It should be the same shame command as when you were showing the slide talk.
Yeah.
Okay.
Share a screen.
Share
It's
screen.
a green.
Yeah.
It's a green.
You will just see this, right? This is
Oh, I see. That's too bad.
You have to stop your slideshow to see.
Claudia has the directions in the chat.
I don't know. You can pin her. Oh, pin myself. Great. Pin like this. Can you see this? Wait a minute. No. Okay.
No.
I don't know.
You have to
Well,
close the presentation. Yeah.
Maybe if it's not going to work, I can assure you the saw-whet owls are small. They are a bit bigger than what they look like on Myrthe's on our screen. No, that's not going to work. So anyway, put the owl close to the lens and we can see it up close. There you go. So I just thought you'd like to see a live owl on location at Beaverhill Bird Observatory. Thanks, Myrthe, and thanks, Jana. So the other stations, there's a fifth one, and I don't remember where it is. And then I mentioned the ones that Alberta, Canadian Wildlife Service are going to put up. And how close? Sorry, I can take the next question, Karen. How close do the birds have to be to the tower? 15 kilometers. So the tower has a 15-kilometer radius. So ideally, we'd have towers spaced every 30 kilometers, but staggered so we don't lose a lot of space in the corners of the circles. And what's neat is, if you remember the picture that we showed of our tower, it has 3 horizontal antennae, and the computer attached to those, each antennae has a cable, and the computer can determine which end of the antennae is picking up the signal first and picks it up last, and actually give us a direction that the bird that's detected came into the 15-kilometer radius circle and what quadrant it left from. So we not only get a timing of it being there, but we actually get a directionality to how it's moving in real time. But I should point out, we did activate this in July, and so far we haven't had a hit. And that's probably because there aren't a lot of projects using the nano tags, using the Modus tagging system in the Prairie, Canada. And it's a catch-22. There's no point in putting tags on birds until there's enough towers to pick them up. So that's certainly what we're waiting for at the Bird Observatory is a few more towers, and then it would make it worth putting tags on birds so that they can be detected. I could also point out the hypothesis that more of our birds are going into BC than we realize because nobody's finding them there. We'd be able to test that with all of the Modus towers that are up and down the Fraser River Valley, all the way up to Kamloops, and in the South Okanagan. We'd be able to find out if any of the owls that are coming through central Alberta are in fact originating or moving to southern BC.
We had a question too about the Rocky Point Bird Observatory, which I believe is on Vancouver Island in the southwest, but I'm not exactly sure the exact location.
Yeah, it's just north of Victoria. They have actually 3 field stations, but they're fairly close to the north of Victoria and fairly close to the coast, or on the coast.
Okay. Then I had a comment, excuse me, and someone was asking about, is avian influenza affecting the saw-whets or other owls?
Not that we know of. So avian influenza is really a flu, a virus of water birds and water-associated birds. So we all heard about the geese being a problem. It spreads quickly in gallinaceous birds, so it's a problem where birds are in close quarters, like chicken farms, turkey farms, duck farms. And so once the virus gets into a farm, then it's a big problem for the farmer, the producer of game or the birds. The other group that it has been a problem for are any birds that are scavenging. So that includes a lot of our raptors. So it's not spreading from raptor to raptor because the raptors are relatively solitary. But where raptors find a carcass, then they can die from avian influenza because they're scavenging the carcass. And at the Bird Observatory, we also had a couple of skunks die that were staggering around in the daytime, showing symptoms of avian flu. So they were likely along the shoreline of the lake, scavenging dead waterfowl and suffering the consequences. I don't know of any information that that owls have been affected. And one could speculate, since especially saw-whets aren't known to be big scavengers along water edges, they're less likely to be affected than other birds.
Okay, thanks. Had another quarter question comment, and it goes, are the percent of movements going southeast approximately 70%, the same as what our publication showed?
Yeah, we have not quantified it. So yes, Lisa, I always quote your 70% are going southeast, and then other percentages are either going southwest or not moving at all. But roughly 3/4 are going southeast, 3/4 of the recoveries. And again, there could be a bias, as Lisa knows, in the reporting of those. There are far more saw-whet banding stations east of us all the way into the eastern U.S., northeastern U.S., than there are west and south of us. So they're more likely to be detected that way.
Another couple questions. How is this year going so far? I'm waiting anxiously to hopefully have a resident saw-whet again for the winter, but no sightings as yet. Are numbers dipping low on the chart?
I'll let Sara answer.
Yeah, saw-whet owl captures this rate this year are fairly slow, but we're hoping it's because it's been such a beautiful warm fall. It's been delaying migration. And so far it seems like that's potentially the case. We've had a small peak in our owl captures over the last week, where we're hitting double digits with 11 captures, 16 captures a night. But that should have been occurring 2 weeks earlier if you look at our historical overall range of captures throughout the season. So it seems like it's a bit of a late migration. On top of that, the numbers, though, aren't as high as I would expect them to. We're coming off of a low year in 2020 on their cycle. And so last year, our capture rate increased a bit, and we were expecting this year to increase. But we're still lower than I'd like to see, or what I'd expect to see, I should say. But again, we're still catching a decent number of owls every night. So it could just be a late drawn out migration since it's been so beautiful. And now with the temperature about to plummet, maybe we'll get a big push of owls, but it's still too early to tell this year.
And you can tell from Sara's reaction, she's one of the few people in Alberta praying and hoping for cold weather sooner rather than later.
I want the owls.
So I got another couple questions about Motus towers. And the question was, do they need to stand alone or can they be piggybacked on cell towers? And if they are they suitable in an urban area?
Yes and yes. I dreamt of TELUS or Bell or somebody saying, hey, this would be great to put on every cell tower across the country, and that would solve all our problems. I don't know if there'd be electronic interference. I'm not a electronics radio wave whiz, but certainly they can go up anywhere. The one in Calgary, which I don't know the individual has put it up, the map shows it's right in Calgary. So they certainly can go into urban areas. Obviously, if they're not at the highest point, then there's going to be interference from other buildings. And a question I don't know, a question I was asked out of the bird observatory, but I haven't found an answer, is we know the detection is 15-kilometer radius, but what is the vertical detection? So what kind of a cone? One could imagine the antennae is picking it up, but there's likely to be a cone of detection. And if it's right overhead, does it pick it up? And if it's underneath, or is there in fact an optimum cone of detection out from in that 15-kilometer radius? And that I don't know. So that might be an influence if it was in an urban area.
And Lisa made a comment that great horned owls are being heavily impacted in southern Alberta by the avian flu. And Kim Blom mentioned that great horned owls were dying from this avian influenza this past spring from eating the carcasses.
Okay, thanks for that. I didn't know that. Hopefully there weren't any saw-whets in their samples.
Okay. Lisa also made the comment that there's very low numbers of nests this year in the boxes.
Right, and we could have mentioned that earlier. There are a number of volunteers, including the Priestleys, that operate nest boxes. There's something well over 200 nest boxes, and I'm not sure anyone's compiled them, but anecdotally, there's like 3 or 4 of the 200 boxes were occupied this year. What we don't know is how much our numbers are influenced by the local population versus, as I talked about, and from Chuck's research, indicating that quite a few of our birds come from further south. But I also don't know what their breeding success was like in Montana, Idaho, etc. Lots of unknowns, and really at this point, not a good network of saw-whet owl banders and researchers in Western Canada. The OwlNet program that Myrthe was able to tap into is focused more on Eastern North America banding stations.
Okay. Then we had a question asking about success with catching and tagging owls at BBO.
Sarah?
What about the success of capturing them at BBO?
I'm not sure. It didn't kind of go on to that. Maybe just a commentary of from year to year.
The answer would be yes, we are successful at catching and tagging them.
Yeah, the peak in migration is normally early October. On average, at this time of year, I should be coming out of double digits, potentially up to 20 owls a night, and getting back down to single digits. But again, it's been a late migration. The weather's cooperating. We're catching owls every night, though, still. Catching up to 8-9 owls, so are catching them.
And then this next question kind of ties in with that. What are some examples of the possible biological significance of the 4-day delayed migration?
We'd have to speculate. There may be none, but the longer birds stay here before they migrate, the greater the risk they get caught in an early snowstorm. So those of you that have been around Edmonton for many years will remember, I believe it was October 96, it snowed in the middle of October and the snow didn't melt until April. So birds that are owls or any other species that are delaying their migration risk getting caught in that early snowstorm. And then the question is, can they get enough food and get the heck out of here? Or are they going to be caught by a weather extreme like that? A year like this, it probably has very little or no significance. They're able to stay here, hopefully feed and fatten up before they go to migrate.
Okay. And I had another question of what are the common predators of saw-whets?
Anything bigger than them. So long-eared owls will eat saw-whets, great horns will eat saw-whets, barred owls will eat saw-whets. I know Rocky Point Bird Observatory in BC on the island has a lot of issues with barred owls trying to predate their saw-whet owls while they're netting, and have their mist nets set up on certain metal rings on top of their metal conduit, that when a barred owl hits, they hear the entire net jiggle slightly. They can run and get the barred owl before there's a fatality. And so anything bigger than a saw-whet would try and eat them.
And another comment was, do these predators influence the inventory numbers or migration behavior?
It's possible, but it would be speculation. If we follow the comments earlier, if great horned owl numbers were decimated by avian flu to a population level, then that should result in less predation on saw-whets, which should result in more saw-whets, and we're not seeing that. So we'd just be speculating on whether how much predators influence the saw-whet populations or their migration behavior.
And Lisa has made a comment about they had to stop netting when a great horned owl cued in on their trapping station for the saw-whets. So that's kind of interesting.
I have to do the same here at Islet Lake. I have a young pair of saw-whets. Great horns. There's a local nest, and 2 young have stuck around. Most of the time, they're on the other side of the lake, in the Blackfoot. But once in a while, they turn up in my backyard, and I have to quickly go out as soon as I hear them calling and turn the player off and leave it off for half an hour. That happened a couple of nights ago, and I simply stood there with a bright flashlight on the owl until it took the hint and flew across the lake and didn't come back. So, yeah, so far I've been lucky, and at BBO we've caught a couple of saw-whets, but I don't believe we've had a fatality from them getting them. And then maybe, Sarah, the other note is when you release your saw-whets.
Yeah, when we release our saw-whet owls, we walk down one of our forested corridors for release, and we're putting them away from the buildings and into the woods, so they have means of escape if there is a predator in the area that we're unaware of. Our saw-whet owls tend to just fly up to about like head height or maybe just above that, and they stay fairly sheltered in the forest, so there's not an issue with great horned owls predating on them. In the 10 years I've been involved at the BBO, we've never witnessed a fatality of a saw-whet owl due to predation or anything like that. So,
okay. Then we had a thank you, Sarah, saying hopefully the owls are visiting BBO tomorrow. I guess they're probably going there for the banding.
Okay, fingers crossed.
And I think that's all I have for questions, unless anybody else has one or I missed something. I don't seem to be finding anymore. Oh, somebody's saying, hang on a sec.
One sec. Or Melissa could unmute and
absolutely. Or anyone else.
I guess
too.
that's easier, isn't it? Sorry.
Yep.
I was just chatting with my friend who owns they put in cell towers, her company. And so I was asking her if she'd heard of MODIS and if it can go on the cell towers, but I hadn't gotten the answer back yet. So that's why I was like, one sec, I might have the actual concrete answer. But she said she had been looking at them. So I don't know.
Great. Well, if you do find out, Melissa, please put them in touch with us. Birds Canada, who initiated and coordinate the MODIS system, I had a questionnaire earlier this year looking for collaborators, and I get the impression they're trying to put together a national grant proposal, probably to the federal government, but maybe to a foundation to establish more MODIS stations. So it may be, I put them in touch with Birds Canada and see if there's a way of facilitating the installation of more stations across, in particular, Alberta, but across Western Canada. So that would be a great connection.
Absolutely, because they install towers all over just Alberta, but all
over.
Yeah,
that would be awesome. Yeah, it'd be great to get a connection like that and have a company interested in this. The hardware for a station is something between $2,000 and $5,000 if you already have a tower and you already have power. So the costs can go up. It costs us more because we have solar and we needed to get the antennae above the trees. So we've got $37,000 worth of solar system and a $10,000 tower to back up our MODIS. But obviously the solar and the tower serve many other uses, including Wi-Fi internet streaming like we're doing with Myrthe at the station now.
All right, well, thank you. I will keep on this and see if anything comes of it.
Terrific, thank you.
And Lisa just made a comment about having to pay a yearly fee to keep it going. So that's another cost in there too.
Oh, I didn't know that. Nobody's sent the Bird Observatory a bill, so I don't know who's paying ours. Good to know.
Maybe they forgot.
Well, it could be, or maybe somebody else is paying for it.
Who knows?
I won't go asking until I get an invoice.
Absolutely. So lots of thank yous. Great presentation, the three of you. It was awesome. Very interesting stuff. And we'd like to see maybe what's going on in the future. Oh, I got another question here. Owl weights changed over time. In low number years, are they lighter, reflecting a poor food year?
Sarah, I don't know if we've looked at that, have we?
I think I looked at that when I was doing an analysis 3 years ago. Don't remember off the top of my head. Usually we have a low year, you're seeing the volume of rural owls, and particularly hatchier owls, decline. So there's just not as much young flying as there would be in high years. They didn't have as productive a year. And that could be a factor of owl weight and the health of the female when she's laying the eggs. But it's not something I remember off the top of my head at this moment.
I might point out this year, I caught a couple of owls that were still in their juvenile nestling plumage in September, which was unusual. And then even more unusual, I caught 2 owls that were still molting their outer primaries. So that's something that's usually done in July and August, not in October. And virtually every owl that I've processed has got light to moderate body molt still happening. So that's an indication that maybe the breeding season was delayed this year because of our colder, dry spring. And maybe that's related to the later migration. But until the end of October, early November, we won't know if there's a pile of owls waiting to come or if it's just going to be a light year.
And Steve's made a comment in here saying that you only have to pay the fee if you're doing research. If you're just running the station to collect data, there is no fee. So maybe that's why.
Oh, good. And it's good that Steve's listening in from Inuvik. Thanks, Steve.
Hey, Geoff, it's Jerry. Thanks to everyone. Great presentation. And it sure made us nostalgia for home.
Thanks, Jerry and Pat. Enjoy Pender Island.
We had a couple of saw-whets behind us a couple of weeks ago.
Great.
Oh, nice. So that's it. I'm just going to get you guys to unshare your screen, and I want to share mine. So we've got a speaker coming up in November. I'm just waiting to hear back. And she basically is going to talk about something to do with this lady, Louise de Curlane Lawrence, who is a phenomenal person in terms of ornithology research and stuff over the years. I'm not sure if she's actually still alive. I think she may have passed.
Yeah, she's passed.
Yeah, because I was thinking she's much older. But hopefully this topic here, woman watching the bird book, has caught your attention. And so we have this lady coming to talk, or not coming to talk to us, but doing this over Zoom. So that will be quite interesting. And then in the end of November, we also have Lisa coming to talk to us about their barred owl research in managed forests of Alberta. So that should be really interesting and full of lots of good stuff too. And then I'm just posting some of the highlights of the different activities coming up with Edmonton Nature Club. So you can see there's quite a few things here. And always keep looking and checking back to the club's calendar, because there's always updates and things being added as time goes on. So we've got a few owl banding things coming up, and all these events are for registered. So go to the calendar to find out how to register for each event. And we've got the owl banding coming up, 2 sessions of that. And then we've got some great walks coming up as well. And again, as I mentioned, the 2 presentations, one on the 17th of November and the other one on the 24th of November. So that's kind of it for a quick glance at what's coming up. And thanks again to our speakers tonight. That was an awesome presentation. And thanks to everybody for coming out and joining us. And we hope to see you back again in the future. So that's it for tonight. Thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.